Forgiveness is a topic we address quite a bit, most especially at the high holidays, but really all year round. It's a central theme, of course, not only in Jewish life, but generally in human experience. Few of us have had the kind of experience with forgiveness that Stephanie Cassatly has. Given the opportunity, she chose to meet with and have an opportunity to forgive her own mother's murderer. And she's written a memoir, a notice of release, describing her journey. Stephanie is a writer whose work has appeared in literary journals and anthologies and has won a number of awards and notable mentions. And she speaks regularly on the topic of forgiveness, teaches writing and literature at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Her book, Notice of Release, you can see, has an award sticker on the front because it was the recipient of a Nautilus Book Award, an annual major book award in the genre of social and environmental justice, which has been awarded not only to Stephanie Cassatly, but amongst others, the Dalai Lama, Deepak Chopra, and Desmond Tutu. Well, they are indeed in good company with you. Stephanie's powerful personal story is one she is here to share with us this evening. A little later on this evening, we'll have an opportunity for those who would be interested, following a chance for Oneg, we'll say more about that after she speaks, to regather and perhaps have a chance to talk more about her experience. It warrants much more than the amount of time we've been able to invite her to speak tonight. We are so honored and so grateful and so pleased to welcome Stephanie Cassatly to Temple Isaiah.
Good evening. I just first want to say how grateful I am for this beautiful chain reaction of my husband, who recently reconnected with an old friend, Bob and Sally Hubicher, who then invited me to meet Rabbi Jaffe, and who then invited me to speak to you this evening. So I'm deeply honored to be here. And I just take a moment to thank all of you for coming and for listening. Many years ago, about 17 years ago, I was sitting in a room not dissimilar to this one, listening to someone speak about his experience with forgiveness. And to be honest, I was not really prepared at that point to even consider the concept of forgiveness. Because when I was 18, my mother was shot and killed in a convenience store robbery in New Orleans. It completely transformed my life, to the point where when people ask me now, tell me about yourself, the fact that my mother was shot and killed when I was 18 was as significant and formative as the color of my hair, the color of my eyes. I mean, it completely defined who I was then and who I am now. And so when I tell them, that my mother was murdered, and when asked, I usually keep it short and sweet because it makes people uncomfortable, to be honest. I mean, when you tell someone something like that, initially it's quite interesting, and then all of a sudden they want to keep you at arm's length because they don't know what to do with that information. So I typically omit it. But the fact is that this experience completely shaped me. Here are the hard facts. It was 1980. My parents were recently divorced. My mother had been a single mother for a few years, was trying to get back on her feet. She had been a homemaker. She was working in my uncle's convenience store on the outskirts of New Orleans when 3 men entered, one carrying a gun. They held the store up. She gave them all the money. They roughed her up. And then the man with the gun shot one single bullet, which landed directly in her chest, and she died instantly. Because I was 18, my family sort of stepped in for me, and I was spared, the horror of the trial. I never met the man who killed her. I never saw him. I never knew his name. It It was as if it never happened, as if I went back to school and sort of tried to piece it together as best I could. I had started as a pre-med student and hung on by my fingernails to try to just graduate at that point, which I did, but not as a pre-med student. And really, by the grace of God, I think I must have had a hand on my shoulder, because I was able to move forward. I met a wonderful man. I got married. I had some beautiful daughters. But always lurking in the back of my mind was this horrible thing that had happened. And the reality was that the man who killed her was apprehended. He was sent to prison for life. I had wanted the death penalty. My whole family wanted the death penalty. I was a big advocate for the death penalty. But he got life. And the fact is that the reason he got off of a life sentence and was sent to Angola State Penitentiary, got off of a murder sentence, was because he had been high on drugs. He was out of his mind. He was crazy at that time. But he was sent away for life. In Louisiana, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Angola State Penitentiary, but it's a pretty gruesome place. I mean, it's where many of you may have seen the movie Monster Ball or Dead Man Walking. It's a virtual hellhole, or was a virtual hellhole, until about the 1990s, when a certain warden came in and sort of changed the culture of the prison. But my mother's killer spent at least half of his time in this prison. When I think back on the time of when my mother was killed and what it felt like to be an 18-year-old sort of redirecting my life, I often say that it was like being blindfolded and dropped off in the middle of nowhere with no map to get home. And I'm sure many of you in here have had similar losses, sudden losses, painful losses, where we hang on and we put one foot in front of the other and we keep going because that's all we have to do or know how to do, and we just think that that's what we have to do, but it's almost like dream walking. I always had this deep sense of yearning, though, in the background, even as I had children and got married and went through all these beautiful rites of passage in my life. I always had this deep sense of yearning of, that she wasn't there. Her expanse sort of just filled every event, every holiday, every birthday. The first birth of my child, the grandparents' day at school, going out to lunch with a friend and her mother. I mean, it was just everywhere all the time. My mother just walked with me, but yet I could never sort of fill the space. And so 20 years later, sitting in the room very similar to this one, as I said, and this prison minister got up to speak about his work with forgiveness, I was really sort of taken aback. Because I had been born a Christian, raised a Christian, taught that, that Jesus Christ died on the cross and forgave in his death. And yet I sat there thinking, there's just no way I can do that. And I became angrier and angrier to the point where I started crying in the back of the room, and I didn't really understand my reaction. And so when the meeting was over, this minister had seen me and came up to me and asked, what's going on? What happened? And I honestly couldn't at that time even say what it was that had happened. And I said, I don't know. I don't know. And I left. But it was as if somebody had changed this radio dial on a radio, that everything in my life at that point kept circling back to the topic of forgiveness. I would see a movie, I would read a book, something in the newspaper, a conversation. This topic just kept coming up and up and up for me. To the point where I had to sort of confront what it was. And I went back to the church that I had sort of walked away from, wondering, if there even was a God that could let this happen in my life. I went back and spoke to a female priest at my church and asked her, what is going on? Why is this happening? And she asked me to consider the question of what is forgiveness. And I had no idea, because to me, anything that implied letting this guy off the hook, condoning the act, anything that would lessen his pain, to me, seemed inconceivable. And so what we did was we backed into it. We talked about what forgiveness was not. And she helped me see that what forgiveness is not is that it's not condoning the act, it's not seeking lesser justice, it's not drawing a veil over my pain. It's nothing more than releasing all ill will that I hold in my heart towards him so that I could seek a different future than my past. That sort of sat with me for a while. It took a little bit of time for me to think about what that meant, and I digested it for a few months. And in that process, I decided to start doing some research. I began calling the New Orleans Times-Picayune, getting copies of the newspaper articles that had been published at the time, from the murder all the way through the sentencing. And to be honest, it was the first time I learned his name. I did not know this man's name for 20 years. His name was Charles Hodges. For 20 years, he remained sort of an inanimate object, a monster, a demon, someone that I really did not want to know, did not want to know anything about, wanted to hold him, you know, at the pit of hell so that he would suffer. And beyond learning his name, I began to research more about who he was, what kind of life he had, more and more history. And I had all these little bits of information, you know, the newspaper articles. I even spent $400 of my own money at the time, which seemed like a lot, to get all the court transcripts. I read the autopsy reports. I read his testimony, saw his handwriting. You know, it was a really difficult time because it was like I was living it for the first time, because I had blocked so much out of my mind during those years, never having known his name, being spared the trial. I think I sort of just put it in the background and held him up as a monster. But now all of a sudden I was looking at all this information about him, and he was human. He was becoming a human being. And in that process of naming him, learning about his past, which was not an easy past. In fact, he was only 2 years older than me when he committed the crime. He was 20, I was 18. In that process, I realized that something was shifting in me. I was still upset, I was still angry, I was still not prepared to forgive. But I was so upset that I just couldn't put it to bed. And so one day, about a year or two into this, sitting in my office with this manila folder that I had put all this information in, a number fell out, which was the number of the chaplain's office at Angola State Penitentiary. And I picked up the phone and called. And a beautiful man on the other end answered. He was one of the chaplains, and he said, "What are you trying to do?" And what I wanted to say was, I have no idea what I'm doing here. But I said, I'm trying to forgive him. I don't know if I can do it, but I'm trying to find a way that I can forgive this man. And he said, "Why do you want to forgive him?" And I said, "Because I don't know what else to do. I'm in so much pain, I cannot get past this." And we spoke for a little while, and then about a week later, I called him back. And that is when the process began. He told me things, revealed things to me that I did not know about this man who had killed her. And in that moment that I started hearing all these things that evening on the phone with him, I realized that I was moving from a place of hatred, hurt, pain, vengeance, to a place of pity, maybe a little compassion, maybe some understanding, all of which are gateways to forgiveness. And the other thing I found out, which was really interesting, was that in that phone call, the timing of reaching out to this man was incredible. You know, in my faith, we say, you know, the timing of the Savior, because he was terminally ill. And if I had waited another 6 months, he would have been dead. And if I had maybe done it 6 months earlier, he might not have been remorseful. And he was remorseful. And we did have a meeting. We did have an interaction where I understood fully what his life had looked like. And to be honest with you, his life was much worse than mine. I had a much better life than he did. And then he died. And I received a notice from the prison right after he died that was titled Notice of Release. Charles Hodges was released from Angola State Penitentiary on December 23rd, 2000. And I thought, oh my God, they've released him. What am I going to do? Panic struck, because I did not want him out of prison. And then underneath it said, he expired on this date. He had been released. And in that moment, I realized that not only had he been released, but I had been released. And had he not died, had I not forgiven him before he died, I would have lost that opportunity. And so, right after he died, I knew that I had to record this for my daughters. I did not start off thinking I was going to write a book or become a speaker or join the Forgiveness Project that I'm a member of or do these kinds of talks. I just wanted to record it for my daughters. But what I realized as I got into it was that doors were opening. Because I had forgiven him, door after door after door started opening for me in ways that I could have never imagined. The synchronicity of all the things that in my life had been locked up began to relax, began to open. Ailments that I had subsided. Stomach pains went away. Jaw clenching went away. So many things in my life improved when I was finally able to counterintuitively give something to someone that I really didn't want to give to. And what I realized was that I was actually giving to myself. It was a very self-serving act, which I did not realize. So, what I realized also in beginning to write was that there were two major storylines in my life. The biggest one was obviously my mother's murder and the man who killed her. And the second one was a very difficult childhood that I had with a father who was kind of a great Santini type of guy, who I loved dearly, but who was a tormented individual himself. And right before my father died, I was able to work things out with him and came to this very small realization at that point was that hurt people hurt people. My father was a very hurt man, and he hurt a lot of people. Charles Hodges was a very hurt man, and he hurt a lot of people. And I came to realize also in this process that this is sort of a Buddhist belief, and while my origins are Christian, I have really embraced all religions, particularly religions that embrace forgiveness, such as yours, that we are all a fabric. We're a tightly woven fabric. All people, all races, all religions are a tightly woven fabric. And when there's a tear in the fabric, the integrity of the whole is compromised. And that one of the ways in which we heal is to help others heal and to reach out to those that seem inhuman to us or that seem like monsters to us. And this can be incredibly difficult because we live in a time, I know, that is full of hate and full of pain and full of misunderstanding and full of horrible rhetoric and dialogue. And it takes every ounce of strength to possibly even just keep our mouths shut sometimes. But what is the alternative? That's my question, is what was my alternative? I didn't have an alternative. I had to find a better way than suffering and carrying this bowling ball chained to my ankle around the rest of my life. And in doing this and being able to forgive, I actually completely released the bowling ball and released myself from the story. Because if we hang on to the story and we hang on to the past, we are empowering the story. We are reliving the story over and over and over again. We're giving this perpetrator, whoever that might be in our lives, more power over us than they deserve and than we deserve. We deserve better than that. So the two storylines being my mother's killer and then also my father taught me that there's this sort of universal nature to forgiveness, which, I'm kind of a visually organized person. I like to see things in quadrants and numbers and bullet points. And so what I did was I put my story of forgiveness into 6 steps. The first one was that definition. What does it mean to forgive? What does it not mean to forgive? And if we can get comfortable with the definition of forgiveness, that doesn't mean letting someone off the hook, that doesn't mean condoning anything, that doesn't mean, my pain is gone. If we can define it in a way that we feel comfortable with, that's step 1. Because Gandhi says, in the story of an eye for an eye, everyone ends up blind. So we have to make this first step of trying to forgive instead of holding vengeance in our heart. The second step for me was exploring stories. Now keep in mind, I didn't attempt, this is all in retrospect. I didn't do this up front. I didn't know I was doing step 1, step 2, step 3. But the second step of exploring the stories, getting the Times-Picayune, getting the court documents was key for me. Because that sort of started to crack the door slightly open, like, okay, what really happened? Tell me what happened. The third step is accepting that shared humanity, that fabric that we're all together. And it's not just shared humanity, it's shared imperfect humanity, because none of us are perfect. And the idea also that I have learned is that if we start ranking hurts, his act was worse than this act, or I hurt more than you hurt, we risk getting into this whirlpool of, this hierarchy of who's hurting more or who hurt more. And it's sort of a dangerous game because ultimately none of us really know in what circumstances we might do what. In what state of desperation might we do something unthinkable. And so the better thing, I think, for me at least, was to say, I would hope that in those circumstances I would not do what he did, as opposed to just ranking my pain or what he did to me in any kind of way. The fourth step was finding some compassion, which kind of flows naturally, because once we start to understand someone's story, we start to have some compassion. And compassion is the gateway to forgiveness. I mean, it's almost like a domino effect, that once we have a little compassion for someone, forgiveness just kind of naturally flows. And then the other beautiful thing, which is the last step, is that we realize that once we actually forgive, we do not have to renew a relationship. We are under no obligation to continue a relationship. It can be an end, but it's a peaceful ending. It's not an angry ending. And that makes all the difference. In my case, he died, so it was an ending that I didn't have any control over. Had he lived, I don't know what I would have done, frankly. But anyway, that is my story. I just want to say that I still miss my mother every single day. But forgiveness has given me a peace and a healing that if I had not forgiven him, I don't think I could have achieved that otherwise. I don't believe that there is a future or that there can be peace without forgiveness. Thank you. Thank you.